Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. This is a book that I've referenced quite a bit on my YouTube channel, but I realized recently that it's been over 10 years since I read this book. So it was due time for me to reread this, just kind of re-understand what this book is actually about. And I definitely have a very, very different take on this book this time around than the first time I read it 10 years ago. And a lot of the ideas that Jared Diamond presents in this book aren't necessarily original ideas. He takes a lot of ideas other people had and kind of weaves them together into this very fresh narrative. So I think what's unique about this book and why it stands out so much is that he just took all these facts that exist and put them together in this very new understanding of history. I think it really reshaped a lot of people's understanding of history, myself included. This is definitely, I think, the book that really shaped my worldview more than any other book that I've read throughout my life. But like I said before, this time around, definitely I have a different take on this book. And it's quite a controversial book. There's a lot of criticism of this book, but I think the main criticism of this book is that it's very Eurocentric. And this time around, I really picked up on that. I didn't necessarily pick up on that the last time I read it, but this time I did. But it's interesting because this book begins by dispelling a lot of racist myths about why Europeans are the ones to conquer the rest of the world. But I think he pushes this idea so far that it falls back in on Eurocentrism in the end. I'm going to explain why I think that is, but yeah, definitely a lot to unpack in this book. I'm going to break this into two videos. This first video is going to be just going over the main takeaways I got from this book, the main ideas that I found interesting, and just giving my reflection on this book. But the next video, I'm going to go into a lot more of my personal ideas that came out of this book, how I think this book relates to where humanity is going into the future, and just kind of re-examining a lot of the ideas I think Jared Diamond didn't necessarily go into enough, or really didn't go into. But that's going to be video two. This video here is just focusing on this book. So let's dive in and talk about this book. So the opening image that Diamond presents in this book, he spent a lot of time in New Guinea throughout his life, mainly studying birds. But in the process of being in New Guinea and studying birds, he met a lot of the native people of New Guinea. And one of the friends he made was this man named Yali. And Yali posed this question to Jared Diamond. And the question he posed was, why do white people have so much cargo while native New Guineans have so little? So basically, why do Europeans have so much stuff, but these native people that they ran into as they colonized the world had so little? So that's the main idea that Diamond seeks to explain in this book. He seeks to explain why Europeans had so much stuff and why they were able to really just take over the world. And if going off of that, he talks about the settling of the Pacific Ocean and Oceania and New Guinea and Australia, and all these humans just spreading out into the Pacific Ocean. And the settling of the Pacific Ocean is really an amazing undertaking. I think really it was really the most amazing undertaking that humans ever did throughout the history, because the Pacific Ocean is so vast, and there's so many just scattered islands throughout the Pacific Ocean, and humans really settled every possible island they could throughout the Pacific Ocean. And you think about how many people must have just gone out in the Pacific looking for land, exploring. It's never seen again. It's such a vast area. And the region of the Pacific Ocean ranges from subarctic to tropical, and it's just such a vast area where every possible biome exists. And going off of that, as we set up different civilizations and societies on various islands that were isolated, every possible type of government and society, based on the technology that the Polynesians had, really emerged throughout the Pacific Ocean. So it's a really, really rich environment just to analyze different civilizations coming in contact with each other, how they interacted with each other. And there's just so much to explore in that idea. And as he discusses this, one interesting thing that I pulled out of this book that I wasn't really super aware of before I read this book, as humans moved into New Guinea and Australia, and even into the Americas, I believe 30, 40,000 years ago. Before humans arrived, there were so many huge megafauna, so many huge animals existed throughout Australia and New Guinea specifically. And right when humans roughly arrived there, those megafauna were wiped out. And I think the likely explanation for that, which Jared Diamond presents in this book, is that humans just hunted these animals to extinction, because places like Africa and really in Eurasia, humans evolved with all of these megafauna. So there's still elephants and giraffes and all these huge animals that exist, but In places like Australia, these animals weren't used to humans, so humans were able to pick them off very quickly and just wipe them out. And this is also speculation, because it also, he poses the argument people have that the reason that these animals died out was because of the Ice Age. All these retreating glaciers just changed the environment that caused all these animals to be wiped out. But these animals existed through several cycles of ice ages. So Jared Diamond kind of explains that it's kind of a stretch to say that's the reason and not humans. But the fact that humans arriving and these animals getting wiped out happened at roughly the same time, I think it's pretty clear that humans had something to do with that. So with that explanation, you really see that humans have really been destroying the environment as long as we've been around. We've been wiping out species and just causing damage to the world as long as we've been here. So all of this climate change that we're having today that's likely driven by humans, humans have been doing terrible things to the environment for as long as we've been around. So as he continues to describe the settlement of Australia and the Pacific Ocean, he talks about these islands known as the Chatham Islands. And the Chatham Islands were the last series of islands to be settled by humans as we expanded throughout the Pacific Ocean. This happened roughly between the year 1400 and 1500 AD. So right around the time that Columbus was discovering America, humans were still expanding out into the Pacific Ocean as we, settled into the world as we moved out of Africa. So this process of settling the Pacific Ocean and settling the world really isn't that, it was still happening very, very recently. So that's very interesting. But the people who settled the Chatham Islands, they were hunter-gatherers. And this hunter-gatherer society that they developed existed at the same time that there were farming societies throughout the Pacific Ocean. Particularly in New Zealand, there was a lot of farming people who lived in New Zealand, who settled in New Zealand around that time. And when these farming people of New Zealand came in contact with the hunter-gatherers of the Chatham Islands, they completely just wiped out their society, completely devastated the inhabitants of the Chatham Islands. And this image of farmers wiping out hunter-gatherers is a story that repeats again and again and again throughout history. It happened all throughout Polynesia. Whenever the farming people came in contact with hunter-gatherers, they always wiped out hunter-gatherers. It just happens again and again and again. It's quite sad, honestly, that humans are so destructive that they just, destroy anyone who doesn't have as much power or strength as them. I think it even goes back further than farmers and hunter-gatherers. Like, there were so many groups of hominids who existed at the same time, and Homo sapiens are the only ones that exist now. So you can just see that Homo sapiens wiped out all the other species of hominids, and then farming Homo sapiens wiped out all of the hunter-gatherers. So it's a process that happens again and again and again. And that's, I think, the main image that Jared Diamond reflects back on as he explains why Europeans wiped out native inhabitants of other parts of the world. But I also found it super interesting that he talks about the Americas during this time when humans were settling the world. It's kind of a myth that the Americas were just completely isolated, completely sealed off. I mean, obviously there was very little contact, no contact between the Europeans and the natives of the Americas for tens of thousands of years. But when humans moved from Siberia into North America, when that land bridge was still there, the Siberians and North Americans had contact with each other continuously. I mean, it wasn't very in-depth contact, but it was somewhat sporadic. But there was still movement back and forth between Siberia and North America after that land bridge closed off. So we weren't really isolated there at all. And in the Pacific Ocean, a lot of the chickens that existed in Polynesia exist in South America, and sweet potatoes in South America exist throughout the Pacific Islands. So if there was contact between the people of the Pacific and the people within South America, it was sporadic. It wasn't very in-depth contact, but there was contact that happened. See, the Americas were never fully isolated. They were mostly isolated, but not fully. I think it's just interesting to think about that the whole world was connected through trade networks. I mean, they weren't direct trade networks. Like, you couldn't be in Europe and, go to the Americas and trade with them. But indirectly, people traded with people who they were within contact to. But there's a network of contacts that can be traced from the Americas all the way to Europe, even before time of Columbus. It was sporadic, but it did happen. But after Jared Diamond gives some background on humans settling the world, he gets into the contact between Europeans and humans within South America. He talks particularly about when the explorer Pizarro met the Incas, and the Spaniards just wiped out thousands and thousands of Incas, and very few Spaniards died in the process. They just completely wiped out their civilization, and the defeats that the Incas had were just staggering. And just dozens of Spaniards were able to kill, hundreds and thousands of natives that they came in contact to. And it wasn't just through guns and steel weapons; it was through germs and disease. The Spaniards were able to wipe out pretty much 95% of the inhabitants of the civilization they came in contact to before they even met them directly. So the difference between the natives of South America and the Europeans, just that contact just shows how much more advanced the Europeans were. And it's just staggering just to really see what that contact was like and how brutal the Spaniards were to the natives that they ran into. And a lot of these defeats in battle that the Incas had, Jared Diamond talks about how a lot of people question why that was. How could they be so dumb to be tricked, to be lured out by these Spanish, where the Spanish overwhelmed them with their tactics and just completely wiped them out? But Diamond talks about how the Incas had no concept of mass conquest. Like, they had no understanding that the Spaniards could wipe out their entire civilization. Stuff like that didn't happen in the Americas. So it's understandable that they had no concept of being tricked by the Spaniards to be completely wiped out by them. So it's just very interesting just to analyze how these two distinct groups came in contact and how the interaction of that was just so devastating to the native inhabitants. But the Spaniards had horses and guns and steel weapons and writing and all this maritime technology. So the natives had no chance whatsoever of defeating the Spaniards when they finally came into contact and fought each other. But I think the main image that Jared Diamond is trying to present by demonstrating how the Spaniards wiped out the Incas is that this kind of thing was happening all throughout history. It happened in Polynesia as different societies came in contact with each other. And it doesn't make it right at all, but this happened again and again throughout history. And after Jared Diamond presents this image about how devastating the contact between the Europeans and Native Americans were, he talks about why farmers were able to do that to hunter-gatherer civilizations. And the Incas weren't hunter-gatherers. They were established civilization, but generally as Europeans moved throughout the world, they were coming in contact with hunter-gatherer societies. And it really goes back to the developing of farming as the first cities emerged in Mesopotamia, and when farmers started to come in contact with hunter-gatherers. And farmers always overwhelmed hunter-gatherers. And the main reason was because they were just so much more numerous. There were so many more farmers in a farmer civilization than there were in these scattered band of hunter-gatherers. So when they came in contact with each other, the farmers always overwhelmed hunter-gatherers. And they had horses, and they had written language, and they could travel much quicker and spread information much quicker. So everything about farming civilizations gave them so much more advantage over hunter-gatherers. But the life of a farmer wasn't necessarily better than the life of hunter-gatherer, because farmers worked way harder than hunter-gatherers. They worked way more hours, and since they were in such tightly contained civilizations, disease spread so much more quickly, and because their diet was more limited with what they grew and they weren't gathering wide varieties of things, there's so much more malnutrition. So the life of someone, a farmer who lived in the city, was not necessarily better at all than a hunter-gatherer. So I think it's kind of a myth that people who were farmers were way superior than hunter-gatherers, because their societies had so much more issues in these cities than hunter-gatherers had out roaming the world. And this book talks about how despite this change from hunter-gathering to farming being so much more difficult, it really wasn't an intentional thing that happened. That's the image that Jared Diamond presents, that this transition from hunter-gathering to farming emerged naturally. It wasn't this intentional decision that people made to start farming. And it really came down to when different societies were weighing the pros and cons of different activities versus survival. Farming was a more predictable activity. It's so much easier to predict where your food's going to come from when you grow it yourself and you know how the year's going to go and what you're going to grow. It's just a much more predictable lifestyle. I think it really gets at humans being very interested in instant gratification, just wanting whatever's easiest, what's more predictable. That's a humans more likely to go to. And that's really why we moved from hunter-gathering to farming. And before there was farming, there were a lot of pre-farming activities that hunter-gatherers did. Hunter-gatherers learned to gather grains from different plants that they liked, and they learned how to create these plastered underground storage facilities for food that they could store. And they learned how to clear weeds and burn areas to help different crops grow. So before we were even farming, we were doing activities that naturally led to farming. And farming was really just the next natural step in that progression. And with hunter-gatherers, they definitely depleted resources in the areas that they went into. It's very easy for hunter-gatherers to, wipe out a certain plant or a certain animal in areas that they moved into. So it was very easy to tip this scale where hunter-gathering wasn't necessarily going to be the best way for them to live at some point. And as humans moved into farming, it was so much easier to control their resources. And as humans gained the ability to control the resources much easier, human populations began to explode. And these societies and these cities that formed got bigger and bigger and bigger. And Jared Diamond talks about in this book how it's definitely a question of, did farming create denser human populations, or did denser human populations cause us to need farming? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think it was kind of a feedback loop where the denser our populations got, the more we farmed. The more we farmed, the denser our populations got. So it was this feedback loop that led to human civilizations growing and growing and growing. And as these civilizations formed, eventually we created a surplus of supplies. And once there was a surplus of food and supplies, it allowed people to have more specialized roles. And that's where you had writing and new technologies emerged. And as new technologies emerged, these civilizations and these cities got more and more involved. And as they got more involved, you had government and bureaucracy and kings and armies to protect your cities. So it just kind of snowballed on top of each other. So it wasn't this conscious decision to move from hunter-gathering to farming. It just kind of emerged naturally as we developed new technologies and activities along the way. And taking a step back from humans for a moment, Jared Diamond talks about how birds unintentionally domesticate different plants through natural selection. Talks about how birds, when they eat berries off of bushes, they tend to pick the juiciest, the most appealing, appetizing berry they can find. And as they intentionally eat berries that they like, and they go and they poop out these seeds, they're naturally selecting plants that grow bigger berries and produce more food, and they're spreading the seeds of those berries. And he talks about how humans probably did the same thing, because as we ate food, we picked berries and plants that had the biggest fruit and the biggest seeds, and we pooped out that food and we pooped out those seeds. And the areas that we defecated, stuff started to grow out of that. I mean, our feces are a natural fertilizer, so these seeds that we poop out naturally started to grow into nice plants that people wanted to eat. So you can see how we started farming unintentionally, just seeing how these plants started to grow. And talks about how a lot of the domesticated plants and fruit that we eat, they're not naturally like that. Because with plants like peas, when peas have these seed pods explode and they shoot the seeds out everywhere. But the peas that we eat and the beans that we eat, they don't do that, because as humans ate foods that they found, they naturally picked seed pods of peas and beans that didn't explode. So we naturally selected these different mutations in plants that we found, and just kind of it naturally started producing these foods that we could farm. It happened with corn and different grains and all kinds of foods. So this is really likely how this started happening. And after Jared Diamond talks about how farming likely emerged, he talks about how farming only emerged in a couple areas around the world. It emerged in the Fertile Crescent, China, and in the Americas it emerged in one place. And there's only certain areas where the conditions were right to allow farming to emerge. And the Mediterranean region, a Mediterranean climate, is the best climate for farming. And in the Fertile Crescent, there was just a wide variety of plants and animals, and there were so many annual plants that created edible seeds that humans could use for harvesting. And I think it says, I wrote down here, there was 32 out of the 56 large seed wild grasses that exist in the world. 32 of them exist in the Mediterranean region. So the Fertile Crescent was just a ripe place for farming to emerge. And also throughout Europe, there's a lot of variations in elevation. So it allows for different plants to grow in different regions, and it gives humans the ability to grow different types of plants simultaneously. And in this area, we had goats, sheep, pigs, cows, horses. All these animals we could domesticate were there too. So it was just a perfect environment for farming and civilization to first emerge. And even though farming did emerge in the area around Mexico, it really just emerged too late. It emerged much later than it did in the Fertile Crescent, because the Fertile Crescent just had so much more of an advantage that farming emerged much earlier than it did in any other part of the world. And after talking a bit about plants that humans started growing as we started farming, he talks about our domestication of animals. And he references Tolstoy, and Tolstoy has this book, Anna Karenina, where in this book there's a quote that, all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And he used that analogy to discuss domestication of animals, because he says that all domesticatable animals are all alike in their own way, but all undomesticatable animals are undomesticatable in their own way, because all animals we domesticate are very docile and just kind of aren't very intelligent, like cows and sheep. They just kind of are very easy for humans to farm and really use to their advantage. And with domestication of animals, you get meat and milk and fertilizer, transportation, leather, using animals in military conquest, riding horses, and you get the plow and wool and germ resistance. So there's so many benefits in civilizations that use domesticatable animals. He talks about other animals that aren't domesticatable, especially elephants, because elephants are a good example that there are animals that we could tame. Like there was many civilizations that tamed elephants. I mean, the story of Hannibal during the Second Punic War, going over the Alps in his elephants. But these animals that they tamed weren't domesticated. Elephants were never domesticated. So really there's only a few animals that can actually be domesticated, like cows and sheep and horses. So there's relatively few animals that they could do that with. And most of the animals that are domesticatable all existed in the Fertile Crescent, in the Mediterranean region. And after he talks about different plants and animals that we farmed in the Fertile Crescent, talks about how the layout of the continents really favored civilization emerging where farming emerged. Because if you look at the Americas, it's this north-south axis where it's a patchwork of different environmental zones. And in Eurasia, it's really this continuous environmental zone from the Middle East, at least back then, into Europe and really across Asia. So this zone that humans lived in, it allowed farming to spread amongst different people in that area. And with farming communities, you had writing emerge. So they're able to document things very well. So civilization just emerged and just spread very well in this east-west axis. Because, if you go from Europe across Central Asia, it's pretty much the same environmental zone all the way across. So just a ripe environment for civilization and ideas and farming to spread. And as civilization spread and these civilizations got denser and denser in the populations, naturally disease started to emerge. And these diseases that humans first started developing came from animals. So since we had so many animals we domesticated, we were in contact with animals so frequently that disease really spread amongst farming communities. And because the layout of this east-west axis, these diseases could spread all around Eurasia. So Europeans and Asians really developed this super immunity to diseases and germs that Native Americans did not have, because they didn't have as many domesticatable animals that we had in Eurasia. So you really see, once again, how Eurasia was really just a ripe environment for people to develop these immunity to diseases other people in the world didn't have. And as these civilizations got more and more involved, we had writing emerge. And writing started very simple, where it was just nouns and numbers and very basic things. And as people started farming, there's more of a need to record information. So naturally, writing and language got more and more complex in these farming communities, and it spread very easily around Eurasia. And it allowed languages that were spoken to spread across very large areas. Like, look at the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, everyone spoke Latin at one point. But if you look at in North America and South America, it's a patchwork of languages. There's not really one broad language that covers one whole region. There's so many isolated languages within the Americas. So that also contributed them to not being able to grow their civilization as big, as quickly as people in Eurasia were, because their languages were more separated and isolated. They didn't have languages across one broad region. So these are the main arguments that Jared Diamond presents as to why Europeans had such a greater advantage over native people they came in contact with around the world. And going off of that, he talks about a little bit about the development of various governments and states around the world. He talks about how humans grew from, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, and those bands of individuals slowly formed tribes over time. And these bands and tribes are very egalitarian. Things were very much shared amongst the people. And it's not until we develop chiefdoms and states much later that things begin to get more complex. As we develop farming in cities, things become less egalitarian and more centralized. And these centralized civilizations had so many more advantages over bands and tribes of hunter-gatherers. So you see once again that civilization developed so much more quickly in Europe and Eurasia that they had so much more of an ability to control their people and be very centralized and form a civilization that can move out into the Americas and wipe out all of these hunter-gatherers. And he talks about the Cherokee chiefdoms in the Americas, how chiefdoms are not as advanced as states in their ability to control their people and create a flourishing civilization. But as the Europeans started wiping out Native Americans, the Cherokees formed these confederations that basically became states. And once they formed states, they were able to fight back against the Europeans much more effectively. But at that point, they weren't going to be able to push the Europeans out of North America. But it just shows how the more that you can organize your society, the more layers you can add to your state, the much more effective you're going to be to go and colonize another part of the world and wipe out hunter-gatherers that you run into. And from there, Jared Diamond really talks about New Guinea quite a bit. He talks about New Guinea and the Aboriginal Australians in quite a bit of detail. And I think this is where my criticism of the book really starts to begin, because as he talks about Europeans coming in contact with people in New Guinea, he really talks about how Europeans brought medicine and they brought new concepts of government, and a lot of tribal warfare stopped amongst the people in New Guinea and the Aboriginal Australians. So he really presents a lot of things that he considers positive that he brought to that Europeans brought to Native people around the world. And there definitely were new things that helped their civilizations become more advanced. But it's really glossing over all the horrors of colonization, not talking about how the Europeans basically enslaved New Guineans that they came in contact with. So I feel like this book really doesn't give a human cost of colonization the weight that it deserves. I think it's definitely misleading to people who don't understand the fuller, broader history, because by glossing over that, I think it really deceives the reader and thinks that there were more benefits to colonization than drawbacks, because the Europeans were brutal to the people they came in contact with. So I think it's hard to make the argument that there were more benefits when we were just so brutal to them. But once again, Jared Diamond, I think, talks about how this was he kind of presents it as a natural thing that was just naturally going to happen. And I mean, this kind of stuff did happen again and again throughout history, but I think the way that he presents it just it's easy to kind of read it as a justification for the evils of colonization. By presenting it as this natural thing, it just kind of makes these terrible things the Europeans did seem normal and okay, and they weren't okay things that we did. So I think by understanding the broader history of colonization and just humans in general, I think it really just demonstrates how just terrible humans can be. Like, humans really do to each other the worst things that humans can do. And this book really doesn't go into that too much. I mean, it talks about it, but just the way that Jared Diamond presents things, it's not directly talking about colonization in a good way, but just his framing of things just kind of rubbed me the wrong way sometimes. Because I think sometimes the things that he does not say carry as much weight as the things that he does say. So I think by describing the process of farmers wiping out hunter-gatherers as being a very natural process, as being something that was just inevitable, and presenting that as a way to dispel a lot of the racist myths, I think by making it seem like it's something natural and just normal, it's really more Eurocentric than dispelling racist myths. So by trying to be anti-Eurocentric, by describing Europeans wiping out the native populations of the Americas and other parts of the world as being natural and just something that was inevitable, that was going to happen, and comparing it to it's happening again and again throughout history, it just becomes, like I said, more Eurocentric in a strange way. Another thing that I kind of picked up on this book is that I wouldn't call Jared Diamond deterministic, because I don't think that anything was necessarily inevitable. Definitely, these geographic advantages definitely made it more likely that certain groups would become the ones who spread their civilization around the world much easier. But I don't think he gives enough weight to decision making. I mean, he talks about how decision making does have an impact. How the culture of one group of people may not favor them wanting to turn to farming, but he mentions it so briefly, and I think decision making carries much more weight in these events that happen throughout history. And I know this is kind of getting into the historical materialism versus idealism understandings of history, but I feel like a little bit of each carries some weight. I mean, I think the natural environment definitely has much more of an impact on how civilization develop, but people can make decisions. People have free will. We can make decisions to do smart things or stupid things. And one good example he gives is the QWERTY keyboard. How when we developed the keyboard, the very early keyboards, they kept jamming because people were typing way too fast. So they intentionally rearranged the letters to force people to type slower because the technology of typewriters couldn't keep up with the speed that people were typing at. And now that technology has advanced to the point where we can make typewriters that don't jam, we can type much faster now with these new technology that we have. We're still using these old keyboards that make us intentionally slower. So, if we could develop these new keyboards or new typewriters today that allow us to type quicker, like that could really advance our civilization today. We could do much more if we could type so much quicker, but you can see how how people don't want to change something is something that's still holding us back today. So this has happened likely throughout history. Just because one group of people turned to farming, other people may not have turned to farming because their culture just didn't allow it. They didn't want to turn to farming. They just had different ideas that prevented that. But in the very end of this book, in the epilogue and the afterword, he starts getting into decision making a little bit more. He talks about China. And he only touches very briefly on why Europe and not China were the ones to colonize the rest of the world. But one example he gives is that China was unified very, very early on. They had a very cohesive civilization, unlike Europe, because Europe is very fragmented. And because they were unified, the weight of a single decision carried much more value because China in the early 1400s started building big ships and exploring parts of Asia and all the way over to Africa at one point in their exploration. But I believe one of the emperors in China made a decision to stop exploring. He made the decision. And because China was so unified, that decision affected a much broader region than it did in Europe. Because when Columbus came to Americas, Columbus went to 5 different countries before he found a country that would back his exploration, his expedition to the Americas. So, in China, if one leader said that we're not going to do this anymore, that decision carried so much more weight. When in Europe, you could go to different civilizations or different countries and find someone who might back your journey. So because it was so much more fragmented, it was much easier to have a group that would end up exploring versus having the whole area decide not to explore. And it really talks about how Europe's geography just favors disunity. There's so many more islands and peninsulas and just weird things in the geography of Europe versus Asia, where China's located, where it's a much bigger area, where it's this much broader region without all these little peninsulas and islands in the way that there are in Europe. And that's, I think, the main argument that he makes as to why China was unified very early on and Europe wasn't. And because Europe was a little more fractured, it created an environment where there's much more competition, where it allowed one group of people in Europe to go exploring when other people didn't, and then the whole area could benefit from that once one group started exploring. He talks about how Europe was constantly trying to unify itself, from Rome, which ended up fracturing, and then Charlemagne, Napoleon, even Hitler were trying to unify Europe into one broad civilization, like what happened in China. And because of Europe's geography, it just wasn't a place where that was going to happen. And I think it's really only today when you're starting to see the possibility of Europe becoming unified under something like the European Union. So we're really at a point now where we might finally see a unified Europe. But I mean, who really knows? I mean, anything is possible at this point because, like I said before, Europe's geography doesn't really favor unification like it does in China. And this is also starting to get into the great person theory, where can one person really change civilization? Can one person like Napoleon or Hitler really change the course of history? Or are they people who are just riding the wave of where civilization was going anyway? But I think that the argument that Jared Diamond makes is that individual people can nudge history in a certain direction, but they're really just riding the wave, like I said, of where civilization is going to be progressing naturally. So this is once again getting into the idea of how much do ideas govern our civilization, or how much just the natural geography of a area, how does that affect our civilization? So in the end of this book, he's starting to give the reader bits and pieces, the different directions that his ideas can be taken. But one thing that he discussed in this book is about how when you're looking at history as a whole and discussing these broad trends, it's much easier to discuss and analyze broad trends than it is to discuss very small decision-making things. Because he uses the example of the gender of babies. So if you have 1,000 babies that are born, you can pretty roughly predict that 50% are going to be male, 50% are going to be female. But when you have two babies, it's much harder to make that prediction. It's much more likely that you're going to have two boys or two girls than a boy and a girl when you're looking at such a smaller group of people. I'm not really a mathematical person. I can't really explain that super well. But basically, the argument that he makes is that it's much easier to analyze broader trends. And I think broader trends have much more to do with geography and natural state of things, and smaller things have much more to do with individual people. So I think that in the bigger sense, what Jared Diamond describes about geography dictating where history goes, I think that's generally true on a broad scale. But on a very, very small scale, I think people's decisions do carry some degree of weight, much more than I think we realize. But another takeaway that I got when I got to the end of this book is that the idea of the Fertile Crescent, this area that was perfect for farming to emerge, this Fertile Crescent is constantly moving. The Fertile Crescent is more of an idea than a physical location, because the emergence of farming was definitely beneficial to early humans. But in much more modern history, I think access to oil or access to precious metals definitely I think is the new farming as we move into the future. But yeah, those are my major thoughts on this book, major takeaways they got from it. And I'm going to do another video after this going into what I think these ideas say about the future, and go into some things I think Jared Diamond didn't necessarily cover well enough, or didn't go into much detail about. So I'm going to do another video on this. I'm going to stop this one here. I've rambled quite a bit here, but yeah, overall, I think this book definitely presents a lot of interesting ideas. When read in context with other things, I think it definitely explains a lot of things about why our civilization, why our society is the way it is today. But like I said before, there are drawbacks to this book. It's very Eurocentric from a certain point of view, but overall, I think this book really presents a fresh narrative of history. When this book came out in the 90s, I think it really had a lot of impact on people. And I definitely think it's still one of the best books I've ever read about history, even though reading it today, I don't think of it quite the same way as I did the first time I read it, but still a great book. Jared Diamond did a great job with this book. Would definitely recommend reading it, but we'll talk later in the next video about more ideas about the concepts explained in Gun, Germs, and Steel. So be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.